Hey everybody, welcome to a basement in South Eugene, where I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about fuel for game day performance. I just wanted to introduce myself first of all. I'm Sean Breslin. I'm one of the chemistry professors here at UCC, and Craig asked me to kind of throw something together, talking a little bit about nutrition or kind of considerations for the student athlete. And normally this thing would be a little bit more interactive, but hey, man, this is the kind of the place we are right now. So one of the important things that I hope you get out of this is a basic understanding of carbs, or more specifically carbohydrates, and how your body uses them. Hopefully, by the end of this thing, you'll have some insight into new ways to improve athletic performance beyond just more practice cardio lifting. I swear to you, if I knew half of the things in here when I was a student athlete, I would have been a heck of a lot better. But I didn't really know what I was doing, so hopefully I'll just kind of pass on a few of my opinions that might be grounded in some good scientific literature. Um, and honestly, one of the major things I want you to get out of this, and most of you guys will tell me to go float my boat, but really, sleep is the most important training factor. Nutrition, everything else, that's something that would be great if you had it, but man, sleep is like the one thing that is robust in every single scientific study having to do with like being a better athlete or just a better human in general. So you're probably wondering why you got to listen to this guy with the mullet. I'll be honest, I'm not a nutritionist. I do have degrees in biochem and chemistry, including my graduate degree in organic chemistry. But I have been an athlete my whole life. And another reason that I think that it's really important, or that I might have some kind of insight into game day performance, is that I'm a type 1 diabetic. And so in just a second, I'll tell you why it might be good to be a type 1 diabetic if you want to understand kind of nutritional concerns and stuff like that. So first of all, you probably would like to know a little bit about me. I'll try to make this pretty straightforward here. Maybe I'll turn the camera off too. I grew up in a town called Greene that was right about here, pretty close to Binghamton, New York. And then when I went to college, I ended up in Western Maryland College, which is now called McDaniel. I was recruited to play football there. And then after college, I went on to Cornell University, which is also in upstate New York. Pretty much wanted to go home, and I almost played football there, strangely, but my car broke down on the way to the interview, and I took it as a sign. I was a superstitious little tyke before I became a scientist. Um, but anyway, while I was there, I was always playing hockey and just talking to a lot of the Division 1 athletes, some of which were drafted into the NHL and things like that. So I'd always pick their brains about nutrition related concepts and stuff. Then, after being at Cornell, I moved on to do a year of service teaching at a high school in Fort Worth, Texas, where I also coached football. And so, pretty much football and hockey were my two main sports. I'm screwing around with lacrosse and stuff like that these days, but I've always been, a trail runner, and I lifted a lot, did all kinds of different crazy things. Really love being in the mountains and hiking and such. So anyway, let's get back to that first thing I said. What is that benefit that I was talking about to being like a type 1 diabetic? Well, first of all, it's a good idea for you guys to know a little bit about what type 1 diabetes is. Turns out that we all have trouble utilizing glucose, which is the pretty much the fuel for every single thing that you want to do. And there's the little molecular structure. I wouldn't be a proper chemist without showing you a molecular model kit of glucose. So one of the things that's interesting about this structure is pretty much everything in here is a way to store energy, right? And so like energy is actually stored in these bonds, potential energy. And so what happens when you actually burn glucose is you really do break these bonds apart and essentially release all the potential energy in there. And it all gets burned to water and carbon dioxide, which is actually why we exhale carbon dioxide. So I just thought you might like to see something like that. So beautiful. So one problem with a diabetic is usually they have some sort of trouble making or using insulin. You've probably seen the fact that there's type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes that I have is the one that pretty much doesn't produce any insulin. So I actually have to have a little insulin pump that's constantly pumping that sexy little hormone into me. Um, and here is this next graph just kind of shows you, what you most likely do after you have some sort of bolus of sugar from a meal. Like you can see that you kind of really pretty quickly drop down to the normal range, which is like between 80 and 120. And you never really get too much over 140. And then typically a diabetic, even a pretty well controlled diabetic like me, the blood sugar will kind of spike and tail off as things go on here. So normally you should also understand that the way that your body processes this fuel is that when you eat something and it goes into your small intestine, your entire digestive system's job is really to kind of extract the sugar. And so at some point, there's a bunch of different sugars kind of hanging outside of your cellular membrane. And the job of insulin, which you can see over here, is to bind to a certain receptor, which makes these little things called GLUT4 vesicles come to the surface, which actually are kind of gateways to let the sugar in. And so obviously, if you don't have this little key, the sugar can't actually get into the cells, and that means that the cell can actually turn them into carbon dioxide and water. So type 1 diabetes mellitus, formerly called juvenile onset. So you really don't produce any insulin. It's thought to have a genetic component but it is caused by a virus that kind of initiates a faulty autoimmune response. So why am I saying that there's a benefit to this kind of thing? Type 1s really, usually they're very knowledgeable about all these factors that athletes also need to be knowledgeable about. And one of the things that I've found to be quite a blessing is this idea that like certain complex like response curves and concepts, they're not really just academic to me. Like I can literally feel them, right? They're tangible. Like if my blood sugar is high or low, I can feel it immediately, and I can kind of feel it coming on in general. And honestly, it's a really intimate connection to science. And also, I was only partially joking when I said I'm a cyborg. I've got one machine that kind of sends blood sugars to my phone and then to my Apple Watch. And then I've got a separate device that's this little pod that's attached to my body that delivers insulin. Um, so normally in class, I'd have you guys answer these questions. So maybe as you're just sitting there at your, in your room, or maybe you're even in a classroom, I'm not sure. I'd just like you to answer these three questions, and then we'll kind of talk about each of them as we go through this presentation. We'll take a look real quickly here at what data suggests kind of the best way to fuel your body when you're in some sort of training cycle. Obviously, these things are going to change a little bit depending on your gender. They're going to change a little bit about depending on what your sport is. And kind of also just how close you are. Like if you're in your season, you're not going to be doing the same exact thing as if you're out of season. But these things are backed by science, so let's just kind of jump into it here. So first of all, carbohydrates, just about 45 to 65% of your caloric need is going to be supplied by some sort of carbohydrates, and I'll show you examples of good carbohydrates versus not so good carbohydrates. And fats actually are pretty important as well, 15 to 20%. There's probably a lot of you have seen like keto diets and stuff like that kind of rely on fats as a sole source of energy. Also, proteins, 35% or so, I'd suggest you consuming. And it really does help to like repair and rebuild muscle. And this equation is, if you really want to dial things in, it's a good idea to know exactly how many calories you need every day. These I found are kind of the closest to reality, at least for me personally. This is kind of the, the the equations that I use to kind of figure out when I'm training how much calories I should be taking in. So you probably know that there's all carbohydrates are not the same, right? We've got simple carbohydrates, and so these are kind of like the simple sugars. If you think back to that beautiful structure that I showed you, that glucose, that single monomer, it's called, is something that is kind of considered a simple sugar. And then what happens as you kind of build that structure and like attach a bunch more of those structures to each other, you end up with something that's called a complex carbohydrate. And so things like pasta and bread, potatoes, all those kinds of things. So real question for you guys is, what is the difference? So pretty much monomeric or dimeric saccharides, right? One or two types of sugar kind of stuck together are usually simple, right? So these are things like sucrose or table sugar, lactose, which is the carbohydrate that's in milk. Those are the really simple carbohydrates, which do serve a really particular purpose in the body, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then those complex carbohydrates are that same sugar, but bonded in this like hugely complex network. So, why would you want to choose a simple carbohydrate? Well, it's certainly simple for your body to digest. So if you need some like really quick energy, right? A lot of you guys have probably had like a goo or like had like a Gatorade or something like right before you started to perform. That's usually packed with all kinds of different simple carbohydrates, but it doesn't last very long. So the complex carbohydrates, they take longer to digest, which means that they're kind of, they stay in your system for a little bit longer, and then they kind of fall off after a longer period of time. So if you want lasting energy, really complex carbohydrates are the way to go. So a couple of little slides here. Here's a simple carbohydrate, right? Glucose. This is table sugar right here. You can notice that there's a glucose attached to another saccharide called fructose. As you might imagine, these big giant networks of complex carbohydrates, you can kind of tell that it's going to take a little longer to break these things down. Keep in mind, you're still looking for these little monomeric units to supply energy, right? But the thing is that they're all kind of connected together, and they can't be used until your body kind of gradually chews them down through metabolic processes. But this is just an example of a particular kind of starch, and you can kind of see the different ways that these guys are connected together. One way that's kind of pretty easy to visualize about having some sort of food that's really kind of rich in simple sugars versus complex carbohydrate sugars is this idea of a glycemic index. So you can kind of see the blood glucose of somebody that eats some sort of like high glycemic index food, and you can kind of see that it spikes, but it doesn't last very long, right? And so these are the kinds of sugars that are, good for just like a quick batch of energy. But really what you need to do is, if you're performing, you want to have this kind of spike, but you want to kind of back it up with some lower glycemic index foods. And I'll show you a couple of examples of this. One thing that was always interesting to me in terms of like glycemic index is this: you see that there's actually a pretty substantial crash after only about an hour. And it even kind of drops below what you started, right? It's kind of due to the body's like, a normal person's insulin response, right, kind of gets kicked into overdrive by this like huge bolus of sugar, and it kind of overcompensates, whereas it doesn't really happen with something that has a lot more complex carbohydrate in it. So here's some low glycemic index type foods. You'll notice that nuts, fruits, vegetables, a lot of whole grains, right? Those are all going to have a whole bunch of complex carbohydrates. Whereas the things that are not the best. They have really high glycemic index, that like really quick peak followed by the crash. A lot of processed foods are pretty high, and also a lot of processed breads. Like basically, the closer you can get to kind of like the natural state of things, the better off you're going to be. Um, and also, one of the things that is kind of interesting is that even if a food contains a lot of fiber, right, something that's like really undigestible, complex carbohydrate, right? Some complex carbohydrates your body just can't digest. Strangely, it provides kind of lasting positive effects on long-term energy levels. I always found that kind of interesting. So, what's my bottom line on carbs? Best fuel long-term is really complex carbohydrates with lots of fiber, and of course, sprinkle in some good simple carbohydrates along the way. And I always think if it makes you poop, it's perfect. So, some examples of things that are kind of pretty easy to have right next to you is in terms of simple sugars. A lot of these shot blocks are really good for this. And also, another added benefit of this is it's got a bunch of electrolytes, which are just these little dissolved ions that your body needs for your muscles to fire correctly and your nervous system to operate correctly. You really want to be careful with these. You want to make sure that you've got a lot of water on board. You don't want to just be sucking these things down without balancing out with a little bit of water. Otherwise, you'll screw up your electrolyte balance. Um, I've always thought that if I was going to be doing any kind of like, marathon or ultra marathon, something that's going to last longer than 1 hour of pretty sustained exercise, the goo packets work really well, but if you are in a sport where you don't have to, do something for longer than an hour, I don't know that these things are necessarily great for short duration sports. I would, probably just work on eating some complex carbs like a night or two before my competition for that one. So, um, food basics, just along with a couple of my opinions here. Not all carbs are created alike. One thing that was really big in on the football team and in various what I call musclehead sports, most people are really concentrate on proteins, right? They throw tons of money on its supplements and stuff like that. I really wouldn't do that. I'd get my dose of protein kind of normal ways. Don't go to GNC and spend a ton of money. And one thing that a lot of people, this is kind of changing, but people used to avoid fats. And honestly, I really wouldn't do that. I'd make sure that those unsaturated fats were something that I was taking in pretty regularly. Also, if the vegetables are bright and leafy, usually that is good for fueling up on. So we should talk a little bit about fats. As we talked about with complex carbohydrates, they typically provide quite a bit of long-term energy. That's also something that's true of fats. And kind of interestingly enough, with endurance events and stuff like that, you really want to increase your percentage of fats in your diet, and just make sure that they're unsaturated. And I never really understood what that was until kind of too late. But anything that's from vegetable or nut oils instead of animal fat is a pretty good fat. So I try to eat fish like a seal. We're in a great place in the Northwest. There's all kinds of great salmon and steelhead to catch out there. So that's something that is probably a really good thing to do. In terms of proteins, make sure that those suckers are lean. So we're talking, chicken and tofu and things like that, which hopefully my dad won't hear me suggest eating tofu. Otherwise, they'll think I'm more of a communist than he already does. And about, half a gram to a full gram per pound of body weight seems to be a pretty good idea. But as I said earlier, right, number one bit of advice for being able to perform really is best to get a lot of sleep. That's something that I never listened to. And it's something that I really make hard. I make decisions based on the amount of sleep I get. And I know it's pretty hard and kind of a college to be told that, but it really is awesome. It really will make you a better athlete, I guarantee you. A lot of times, somebody will ask me, what are some good resources that, if I have some extra time. I would say Good to Go by this individual named Christy Auschwanden. It's all about recovery science, and really, it's in one phrase. Like, it's a pretty decent sized book, but like, if there was kind of one thing, like, just don't worry about all the crazy post workout aids and just get some sleep, right? And all this stuff is backed up by scientific data. And also, strangely enough, the elite nutrition program from Beachbody, which I think was part of the Insanity program, it gives lots of great specific meal ideas. You get to eat like what feels like 1,000 times a day. It feels like you're eating all the time. But that's kind of one thing that really changed the way that I eat. So thanks for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'll put my email address in here. I really do encourage you guys to ask me any questions you might have. I really do think that it's a really important set of concepts that I really didn't pay any attention to, and you can really kick some butt if you pay attention to a couple of these things. Don't tell Craig that I gave you these links, but these are kind of like two nutrition-based links from Bro Science Life, which is a totally inappropriate individual from YouTube. But I hope you guys enjoy it. Take care.